here today. I am Laura Aiken, the Director of Graduate and Alumni Career Development. And we're so happy today to bring you a really great topic that's been top of mind for many of our alumni during these times, which is all about re-entering the workforce. And I have to tell you, I'm especially pleased that we have Leanne here today, as she was introduced to the Postal Career Development Center through our Center for Women in Business. So many of you are probably familiar with our Center for Women in Business and the great work they do, the executive leadership workshops and forums that they conduct. And they had actually brought us together to connect. And once the Postal Career Development Center was able to connect with Flex Professionals and Leanne, we were so impressed with all they have to offer and their expertise that we knew we had to bring this to the community. So thank you for joining us. So whether you're re-entering the workforce after a career break, whether personal or professional, or maybe you were impacted by COVID and you're re-entering the workforce, I believe you'll get a lot out of this session. So with that, I'd like to formally introduce Leanne Rod, who is the Director of Talent for Flex Professionals in Boston, and she is a certified career coach. She leads recruiting and programming with a focus on tactical job search training for people in career transition or returning to work after caregiving. Flex Professionals is a niche staffing firm connecting growing businesses with experienced professionals who are seeking part-time and flexible work options in the Boston and Washington, D.C. metro areas. So without further ado, I'll toss it over to Leanne, and please note that I will be checking the chat throughout our conversation here today, and please feel free to use the Q&A function as well, and we will address your questions throughout the presentation. Leanne, take it away.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you all for coming on your lunch break today. This is a topic that I love to talk about. I do it every day in my work with Flex Professionals, and I'm really excited to be here. So thanks for coming. Our agenda today is going to go through a couple of different areas. I think it's a good setup to talk about the changing landscape of work, since that has been on a fast pace in the last 14 months. And then we're going to move into tips, and we're going to talk about concerns of job seekers and employers when going back to work after any kind of break, caregiving or other, and then right into some tips for successful reentry. So just a little bit about Flex Professionals to give you context about why we talk about this. We were founded about 11 years ago by 3 moms who had taken a career break to care for young children, and simultaneously, they didn't know each other, but simultaneously were looking for a reentry path, but needed a little bit of flexibility and for various reasons, and were frustrated at the lack of flexibility that they were able to find on their own. They knew lots of parents who were like them, who felt sidelined by the lack of flexibility in the sort of traditional 40-hour work week, and founded Flex Professionals to help match people who are looking for flexibility with the needs of small businesses. And that's a really great partnership. It's something that we've built over the last 11 years and now have worked with about 18,000 job seekers who are seeking part-time, full-time flex, or project-based, something with some element of flexibility, some kind of role with flexibility. And the folks that we work with at first were mostly moms returning to work, but that's shifted quite a bit over the last 10 years. But they generally fall into 3 categories. They're either coming back after a length of time away from the paid workforce. An average career break is about 12 years. They might be scaling back from full-time to something that is less than full-time, or maybe full-time plus to just 40 hours a week is considered scaling back for some people. Or in the second, third, fourth version of their career, they're making a transition or even approaching retirement and wanting to pivot. So those are the general folks that we work with. And over the last 11 years, have worked with about 700 different employers who have embraced a flexible working model. And up until March of 2020, and this still is true, but now there's more flexibility out there. One of the things that we always talked about as a staffing firm is that our roles had pre-negotiated flexibility, and we were very upfront with employers about what that was, and we still do that. But I know some of the questions that I saw in your registration were about how to negotiate that flexibility piece, and we're gonna talk about that. So if you are here and you're re-entering the workforce after that average 12-year break or something that's shorter and is more COVID related, the one thing that I'd want to get across is that you are definitely not alone. Pre-COVID, about 3,000 caregivers were looking to re-enter the workforce and looking for a piece of flexibility. They were looking for part-time so that they could maintain caregiving responsibilities or care for their own health or have a side gig, whatever their reason was for seeking flexibility. And this stat is incredibly dated at this point, because now we know that after the 12 million people left the workforce in the first 2 months of the pandemic last year, about 4.6 million people have not returned. And these are people whose industries have been so greatly impacted, they haven't been able to return, but a lot of them have taken on caregiving responsibilities that weren't there previously, or they're in a dynamic environment where they have a responsibility that floats in and floats out. They may be delaying some elder care. So lots of different reasons, but this number is about double now. If you are returning to a paid career after a break, you may be facing a stigma of that break. You may also be sensing that there's some systemic barriers, which there are, and you may have some personal barriers just around how much you can commit and whether that is something that you can maintain. So we're going to talk about a lot of that. But just about people who do re-enter the workplace, and this is something that we've seen in other stats, but we also observed in our own talent pool, is that about a third of people return to something similar to what they did before they left. Maybe not exactly, but similar. About a third of people go through a career transition. And this can be it's usually into a different job function. Sometimes a transition is very big just by switching industry, but they do go through some type of career transition. And about a third of people start their own business, either because they are driven to do that, and that's something that they've always wanted to do, or because there's not quite a fit in those other 2/3. And so they create what it is that they want to do. This can be in the form of a sole proprietorship, a typical small business startup, or it could be in consulting. So starting a consulting gig. So I want to talk just a little bit about the changing landscape of work, as well as the workforce and some demographics, because again, I think this is really helpful from a contextual standpoint. So if we'd been talking about 14 months ago, we would have been talking about an all-time low national jobless rate of 4.1%. I know a lot of you are here today from Boston. It was actually closer to just over 2% for folks who had a bachelor's degree. And 68% of companies had reported difficulty in recruiting and hiring. That has changed quite a lot. I'm not going to go through all of the, kind of grueling statistics over the last year, but we were also at a place where we had just tipped over into, I think, 51% of women in the workforce. We work with a lot of women, not exclusively with women, but that number was something that we hadn't seen before, and it quickly went away. And so what we found is that the pandemic has really exacerbated the caregiving crisis and has made it a little bit more challenging for people who are looking to either return or even stay in a position to do so. What is not changing or even trending upward is the gig economy. That still is chugging along. Companies are embracing it a little bit more on a broad level. Flexibility is certainly a big part of our conversation, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, but the remote working, interviewing, and even remote networking has been going strong for the last year. And I'm sure you've all been on other types of Zoom calls where you've actually found ways to connect with people virtually. So the flexibility is trending upward, and we know that that is here to stay. There's been a lot of studies out lately about the number of workers who are expecting flexibility when they go back to when it's safe to go back to the offices. And that number range is about 11% are looking for full remote work. And 70% of returning workers are looking for some level of remote work. And so companies are we work with a lot of HR groups. We know that companies are really trying to get their plans together on how they're going to do that and how they're going to bring some people back, or even gauge who wants to come back into the office. Care crisis and women opting out, we've touched on. The other thing that's on the upswing is this demand for technical talent that never went away. Some of the hiring slowed down, certainly during the beginning of the pandemic, but the if you are in a technical field or considering a technical field, hiring has remained strong. These are things like software or materials engineering, data analytics, technical talent for people who are tech savvy and can take that technical piece into a more traditional role are also in demand. So that has remained strong. One thing that we know, because we were founded in 2010, right after the recession of 2008-9, is that part-time works really well in both strong and weak job markets. So if that is something that you're angling for, now is a great time to be pursuing that, as well as when the economy is a little bit stronger. And just a little bit on demographics before we jump into tips is that there still are quite a few people retiring. Many people have delayed their retirement if their income has been impacted, but there's a significant number of baby boomers leaving the workforce every day. Pre-pandemic, that number was about 10,000 people a day, and that has remained pretty consistent. This is the first time that we've had 4 generations in the workforce, from baby boomers to Gen Z. And what this really means for people who may have had a gap or taken a career break is that you may be going back to a position where you're interviewing or working for someone who's younger than you. And I bring that up because that can be something to get your head around a little bit. You know, it can become awkward if you're not expecting it, but if you go in expecting it and it's not going to be an awkward moment, it doesn't become awkward for everyone. And just going into it, you'll be better prepared. We've also seen a gender shift, the rise in female college grads and a growing female workforce. I do believe that once we can start going back into workplaces and have more consistent care options, whether that's daycare, elder care, or school, that more women will return to the workforce. And so we'll start to see that growth again, but that really was a setback in terms of the number of women in the workforce overall. And before we jump into tips, I know that you all may be having some concerns about reentering. And so we've, kept tabs with the people that we're working with, as well as with hiring managers who we're working with on the other side of the desk, to ask, what are their top concerns if you're going back to work? What are the top concerns in hiring somebody who's returning to work after an unpaid caregiving break? And so you may identify with 1, 2, 6 of these concerns. The top one, and probably the one that gets elevated the longer that you've been out of the paid workforce, is readiness. It's a timing thing. Is this the right time for me? Is it the right time for my family? And then also, how quickly can I ramp up? And the answer to that is going to be different for everybody, as you can imagine, but that is a top concern that we hear from folks who are going back into the paid workforce. A lot of people, and next in line is the technology gap. And just a couple things I'll say about the technology gap, because it is real, whether it's real or perceived, is that sometimes it's not as big as you think it is. Something we typically hear from people who have been fairly good about keeping up their productivity skills is that when they're back at work, there's a change in pace, but that they're finding that they ramp up on the technology fairly quickly, especially if they have done their homework and they know what kind of technology is going to be required in a particular job function or environment. Then that ramp up time is not as long as they thought it would be. There are so many ways to upskill, and we'll talk about that later on, but that has also been something that we've seen tremendous growth in. Something else you may be thinking about or feeling is a lack of confidence. So if it has been a longer period of time since you've interviewed, since you've applied for a job, you may have something eroding at your confidence level in terms of what have you done lately to support that. So we'll talk about that as well. You may be uncertain about your direction and have that desire to change, whether it's a change in your job function or even making some kind of significant change about maybe your level of travel or your willingness to commute into a city every day. So know that there are a lot of people feeling that as well. And then absence of a professional network is something that we hear quite often. So we're going to talk about networking and possibly some outdated industry knowledge, which also falls into networking. And this is by no means meant to be a laundry list or try to talk you out of taking your next professional step. These are all things that can be overcome, first of all, but more so that you know that there are others who are thinking about these things as well. So on the other side of the desk, some of the concerns that employers have are very similar. The technology gap, again, perceived or real, is a concern for some of our hiring managers when we're talking to them about hiring reentry candidates, and possibly lack of confidence. But the two that we hear from hiring managers that are a little bit different are commitment and overqualification. And from a commitment standpoint, when hiring managers are looking at someone who has been out of the paid workforce, so let's say 8 to 10 years, they may have whether it's accurate or not, but they may have a perception that that person has a lifestyle that supports the amount of income that they have at that time. And they're wondering, will there be a long-term commitment to this change in their lifestyle? That's all, again, something that can be easily overcome in how you're positioning yourself in your profile statement on your resume, in your cover letter, in your conversations, but there is a concern. Another one is around overqualification. And this primarily comes in because typically, and I would say not everybody, but typically people who are returning to work either go back at a lateral or slightly below the level where they left. And if you aren't direct about why you're doing that, there could be a question from the hiring manager about whether you'll be satisfied to stay in that job for a long period of time. Again, something that can easily be addressed, especially in an interview situation, and just taken head on so it doesn't hang out there, but definitely one of the concerns that we hear from some of our hiring contacts. So jumping right into tips for reentry. Most people jump to their resume, and that's a really typical thing to hear. You're just starting back your job search. You got to dust off your resume. You got to start scanning used to be the help wanted ads, but now it's the job boards, right? And one of the things that we really hope that you'll take the time to do, if you have the ability to do this, is to start with just a little bit of discovery. And the reason for this is that it has to do with your messaging. So if you take the time to get really clear on what it is that you're aiming for, everything that you start to put together in your job search toolkit will be that much easier. So if you can imagine picking up your resume and being clear on what it is that you're pursuing, or going to update your LinkedIn profile, or choosing what kind of networking events or connections you're going to pursue, that gets easier. And so does your messaging and your storytelling about what you're going to do next. So starting with discovery, you can start with some self-assessment. Sometimes these are structured. You probably have heard of StrengthsFinder and Myers-Briggs. There's so many different types of assessments out there. But basically, you're looking at if you can do some self-reflection and also talk to other people. You're looking at what do you like to do and what do you do well? And so where those intersect. And I don't like to talk about passion and purpose because I think we all have multiple passions and purposes. But if you really look at what you want to do and what you do well and where that intersection is, you might be asking, well, don't I just want to pursue what I do well? And I think what a lot of people find is when they look back at their career path, there are some things that they've done well, or they've even excelled at, that they really aren't interested in doing anymore. And so you're really looking at that intersection. And then you want to also think about how you've demonstrated that in the past. And this is particularly important for people who are in career transition. If you're thinking about or in the midst of a change, one of the things that you'll need to do is elevate what those transferable skills are and be able to position your past experiences in a new way or in a different way. And so you want to start thinking about how you've demonstrated what you're good at in the past or what you like to do. And then the fourth bullet here is about your personal motivations and values. You may be returning to work because you want to be giving back in some way. You may be returning to work because you have a kid that's about to go to college and you really need to up your income. There may have been a shift. Maybe you have a spouse who lost their position, so you're returning to work. So your motivations can really vary, as well as maybe a shift in values. And so if you've been out of the paid workforce for a period of time, very typically, even over a lifetime, whether we're in a paid position or not, our values do shift and change. And particularly over the last year or year plus, there's been a lot of reasons to take a look at what our work values are and how we're contributing. And so taking a look at those can be really helpful in helping you choose what you pursue. And then lastly, work environment. Do you prefer fully remote? Do you prefer to be fully on site? So when you're looking at companies and how they're positioning themselves post-COVID to come back when it's safe, that's something that you might want to take a look at, but also considering things like company size, startup versus more established, and where you're really targeting yourself. So Laura, I'm just going to take a quick little mini break for questions. If there's been anything that you've seen, I haven't been following the chat as much, but if there's anything that's come up related to that before I jump into resumes and other things.
There's no questions in the chat at this time, but I'll encourage anybody to add those questions at this time. Otherwise, we'll continue moving with the presentation.
Okay, great. I'm happy to keep rolling forward. I just always like to stop and try to pair them with the material that we're talking about. One of the things that I saw in the questions that came in through the registration was about flexibility. When you bring that up, how you bring that up, how you negotiate for it. And, that it's going to be a little bit determined by what kind of job you're pursuing. And there are a couple of different tactics. I know there are some resources on the Bentley career site, and I always love to send people to the AAUW negotiation website as well. They have a great program that's online now for negotiating your salary, but also different aspects of your job. I would say the only thing I'd say about negotiating flexibility is that if you are looking for something that is maximum 20 hours a week and you're applying for a full-time job, to really explore the flexibility up front so that you're not taking up someone's time when the flexibility isn't there. But that most roles are going to have some level of flexibility moving forward. Okay. So let's move right into resume tips. And we get a lot of questions about format, length, how many years to go back, how you should say something in this section or that section. And one of the high level things that we always come back to is that your resume is your selling tool. And so when you're asking a question of, well, should I put a career gap statement on your resume? I personally don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I'm in an industry that works with a lot of people who have career gaps. And so my viewpoint on that might be a little different if I was in a different work environment. So you always want to focus it on your selling tool. It's your professional document. So you want to make sure that things that are on your resume support you professionally and that it's focused on what you want to be doing as you move forward. So if you're questioning whether certain experiences or jobs should be on your resume at this point, it's kind of all bubbles up again to, well, what are you moving toward? Does it support and is it relevant to what you want to be moving toward? You definitely want to include experience that shows your demonstrated abilities for a specific role. Sometimes that is not your most recent job that you had on your resume. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 roles ago. And so you want to be thinking about how to elevate that into as maybe the top half of your first page of your resume and really elevating what it is that you want to highlight on your resume. If you're switching your career path and let's say you dusted off your resume a couple of years ago and you think you're pretty set, you may want to go back and take a look at your experience section if you're switching paths to make sure that what you're highlighting in past experiences really does support the direction that you're moving toward. And so if you had a role that spanned 2 or 3 different functional areas, which is not atypical for any job, and you've prioritized what those bullet points and accomplishments are in a specific way that more or less matched the percentage of that role within your job, you may want to take a look at that and make sure that that matches what you're moving toward. If something that you did in a past role was only 15, maybe 20% of your day-to-day, but it's what you really want to be focusing on, you might want to elevate that bullet point or even give it a second bullet point so that you can really show that you have a demonstrated ability in that area. Get used to editing, definitely a lot. Sometimes if we have 20 to 30 years of experience, we've got to net that down. And if you are starting from scratch, one of the things that you want to do is really focus on your content, not your design. This is another area where it can be a little bit of a hang up, especially if you have a design that you've established and you're trying to work within that. Maybe put that aside, start with a blank Word document or a Google Doc file and just start entering your focus areas, your accomplishments, your key accomplishments, or your demonstrated accomplishments in past positions almost like a bank of accomplishments or a bank of verbiage that you might bring into a resume, depending on how you want to focus that particular document for a job that you're applying for. So just a few more resume tips. We're going to go straight down through some of the sections on the resume. If you haven't updated in a while, you might still have a section at the top of your resume that is either called or sounds like an objective. And what has replaced the objective on your resume is a profile statement. And it's really flipping it. It's less about what you want as an objective and more about the value that you bring to a company. And your profile statement should do that. And it really should do that in a specific way. And I say specific because sometimes you'll read a resume profile and it's got a lot of great sounding words, multitasker, collaborator, and other descriptors that don't tell you a lot about the value that that person brings or even helps to differentiate what they bring to an organization. So think of your profile as maybe a 4 to 5 sentence section that really, if a hiring manager or a recruiter reads nothing else but your profile, they're pretty clear on what your key strengths are, your level of experience, and what you're looking for. If you are, wanting to include a gap statement, you can maybe do that as the last section on your profile. Committed to returning to a full-time position in bookkeeping and accounting, or framing that with what you're moving toward. The one place that you may want to include a gap statement on your resume is if you have done something, maybe some substantive volunteer work, or if you've gone back to school or even done some online courses that have worked towards something. That can be a really powerful gap statement because it's showing that you're positioning yourself for what you're moving toward next. And what you want to avoid is something that just includes a gap statement with no other information on it. People are going to see a gap and it's not going to be hidden, but you really want to focus on the professional nature of the information that you're putting on your resume. Again, emphasizing your substantive and relative work. What a lot of people do in career transition or in returning to the paid workforce is they start to think about what would a key accomplishment section look like? If I was going to draw some experiences I had earlier in my career and really want to elevate them for what I'm moving toward next, how do I do that? Bringing it from the second page onto the first page. And the way to do that would be to maybe create a key skills and accomplishments section. And really focusing on your accomplishments and not responsibilities. If it's been a bit since you've updated your resume and you look at those bullet points under your experience section, and they start to sound like a job description, things like responsible for or oversee are typical verbs in a job description. You want to look at those bullet points as ways to demonstrate what you accomplished, what difference you made in a role that you had. You want to look at probably if you think about the interview STAR, if anyone has used the STAR methodology in answering interview questions, it stands for situation, task, action, and result. Your bullet points really are a mini version of that. You're probably going to frame a situation, a result, and maybe your result is going to be first, and what action you took to do that. And so each one is going to show maybe an increase or a decrease. Maybe there was a timeline involved or a number of people that were included in whatever project that you or your team was responsible for, but really focusing on what the outcomes were from those past roles. Including volunteer work is great, especially if it is pivoting you toward what you're moving toward next, but really highlighting the substantive pieces of that. In your chronology is fine. Again, if it's relevant and substantive to include that in your career chronology. Otherwise, you may want to put that into a volunteer section and really work on highlighting the things that you want the reader to pay attention to. And then lastly is including technical skills and proficiencies. You don't need to put every single program you've ever worked with, and sometimes those can be a little dating. Especially, if you're, I'm trying to think of an example, but if your resume currently has, internet searches or expired and not often used software packages, you may want to update those to ones that you've used more recently. But it's something that a lot of people leave off their resume, and the importance of having it on there is from a searching standpoint. So if you are going to be submitting your application through a portal for a large company where they get lots of applications, or you're hoping to get discovered through LinkedIn, you want to make sure that you have your technical skills listed because those are often search terms, and you want to be discoverable. Okay. So we are going to move right into networking and LinkedIn. And again, these are sort of tip of the iceberg tips. I know Laura's putting up some links to the Bentley Alumni Career Center. Flex Professionals also has an ongoing career series. Strategies for Reentry is the start of our series. So this aligns well, but we go more deeply into all of these topics in separate webinars. And I think if she hasn't already, she's got the link for that to put up as well. But we're going to talk about networking and LinkedIn at a pretty high level. And just one, couple little, maybe a little preface to networking is that it's something that, if you had said networking about a year ago, you kind of envision walking into a big room with the "hello, my name is" sticker. And that can have a lot of pressure. And there's not many people that really love to do that kind of networking. One of the things that we've definitely found over the last year is that virtual networking can be effective, but I would just invite you to maybe reframe networking as we're talking about this as one-on-one conversations. You may find somebody that you want to have a one-to-one conversation at a bigger event or maybe on LinkedIn, but networking, is having these conversations one-to-one. And the reason why it's so important, especially for people returning to the paid workforce, is that it's just from the stats that 80% of jobs are found through networking. I think this number is even higher for people who have a career gap, just because your look on paper isn't going to be the same as someone who hasn't had a gap. And you're much more likely to find your next role through your network connections. Even if you're applying for a job while you're using your network, so it's a multi-pronged approach, you're much more likely to get a look or get an interview from your network. So about 20% of jobs are filled through job boards and online ads, which is where most people spend their time when they're in a job search, and it's just human nature. We go out to Indeed, we go out to the LinkedIn job portal. We say, okay, I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna apply for 10 jobs this morning. And sometimes that works, but only about 20% of the time. And so really think about how you're networking and who you're networking with. And then referrals are also huge. I know in our business, when we're talking to someone who we've worked with in the past, if we've placed them in a job, we are much more likely to be receptive to a referral from someone we've worked with and we know they have a great work ethic or they've performed well. If they say, hey, I want you to talk to my friend Steve, he's looking for a job and I know him well, I've worked in a volunteer capacity with him, and there's that introduction, we'll definitely take the referral and look for work that we have that might be a fit. And then lots of jobs are just never advertised. And I know you probably do too, but I know a lot of people who are having conversations as they're networking, and the person that they're networking with says, we could use somebody like you to do either a job or a project. And that conversation becomes employment. And so about 40% of jobs are never advertised. And so just keeping that in mind in terms of the importance of networking, that could be how you move into your next role. So if you are feeling like your network is a bit stale, if you've been out for, even a short period of time, there are definitely some strategies for reconnecting with your network. So if you've been out for, 5+ years, remember that the people that you worked with at that point, they remember you as their coworker. And so they're not going to think about it being a strange outreach if you're getting back in touch with them through LinkedIn or even through a phone call or email. And they're going to remember you as their coworker. So, reconnecting with your past work coworkers is step one for sure. And networking you can also do through side activities. If you're in the process of learning something new, it could be job related or not, and you're in a class that has some type of exchange either with other learners or with a professor or teacher in the group, networking and kind of constantly thinking about the people that you're coming into contact with as being a potential contact to somebody else, just like in LinkedIn, those first, second, and third degree connections. That can be another great place and great networking ground. Volunteering is another great place to do some networking, especially if you're doing targeted or smart volunteering. A lot of people volunteer pair of hands, and we love everyone who's doing that because we need so many hands right now. And you can also take a look at your volunteer activities and say, well, what do I really want to improve? What is it that I want to practice? What do I want to show that I have a demonstrated ability to do right now? Maybe it's something in Excel, and you want to set up a financial spreadsheet for an organization that doesn't have one, or you want to help them go through their books. It may be coordinating volunteers and really building some community engagement or involvement. Maybe fundraising. So you want to you can angle your volunteering toward that to help you demonstrate your skills. And then temporary and project work can be another great way, not only to network, but to network your way into a job. And we see this all the time. We see it from companies who say, okay, I want, this is a real example. I want to hire somebody for 2 months to come in and integrate our new accounting system or a new content management system. Do you have someone who has the skill set? This is 2, maybe 3 months. And 8 months later, 3 years later, they're still there. They're still employed because they've demonstrated their value in that role, and they've either stayed in that role or they've moved on to something else within the company. So be open to temp and project work, and you can use that for networking, but also networking your way into a job. And if you are open to internships or the equivalent, there's a lot of nonprofit sites, idealist.org or Catch a Fire or 2 that I've seen where nonprofits post needs, and they're not necessarily looking for sophomore in college between their sophomore and their junior year. They're looking for someone to come in, and they can't pay them, or maybe they can pay them a stipend that's very low, but the exchange is that you get that experience, you have something that you can put on your resume, and it's also a great way to network, especially if it's in an area that you want to pursue. LinkedIn, again, we could talk for a whole hour just on LinkedIn, but basics, LinkedIn is a great tool for connecting, and I'm sure most people here have a profile. If you don't, it's a great way to reach out, be discoverable, and the basics are to have a professional photo on your profile. You want to have a completed profile, which is the About section, a title, listing your experiences and your education, and then just know that your job title and your the title that appears at the top of your LinkedIn profile, as well as your past job titles, are the most often searched fields on LinkedIn. LinkedIn does not require you to use the title at the top of your profile that matches your last job. You can create that. So you want it to be fairly forward focused. It gives you more leeway than a resume does to be forward focused. You're also talking in the first person, so it's a little bit more of a casual platform where you can maybe do a little storytelling, but you want to make sure that title at the top of your profile is forward focused and that it states what it is that you want to do. They're recruiting, lots of different ways to be actively recruited through LinkedIn. And you can also help yourself by being engaged on the platform, because like all social media, they operate on algorithms, and the more you engage, the more top of mind, the more part of other people's feeds you'll become. And it also shows engagement. So recruiters do check LinkedIn. They look at somebody's LinkedIn profile. And if I'm looking at someone who's in a career transition and they've got engagement in the area that they're moving toward, that's a real plus. And so you want to be engaged and also be engaged in particular ways on the platform. So moving right into interview tips. One of the things I like to say about interviews, because I interview a lot of people, is to not assume that the person interviewing has fully read and digested your resume. Most people in the recruiting world, for sure, in the HR world, where they're moving quickly. And so you want to know your resume. You want to be able to refer to things without having to read through, but also not have the assumption that that person has read your resume. And if you have that viewpoint, if you go into an interview with that in mind, you might position some of your experience a little differently, maybe give a little bit more context about different work experiences. So what's changed? Phone and video interviews are absolutely the norm. I'm usually surprised when somebody's being hired for a position that is at least remote for now. If there is an in-person interview, oftentimes there's not. This was a trend that we saw before the pandemic. It's something that certainly will continue. So just with that in mind, the things that you want to think about for phone and video interviews are your visual appearance, your sound appearance. You want to make sure that you're aware of your background. If you don't like your background, there's lots of ways through Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Skype where you can change your background or blur it. But you also want to take care of your lighting, maybe do some tests on your microphone to make sure that you're coming across clearly. And you certainly want to be in a place where you don't have interruptions and you have pretty solid internet connection. So testing those things before you go on an interview can be really helpful. And just from the interview content standpoint, some things you might find are behavioral and skills-based interviews. Behavioral interviews or behavioral questions in interviews sound like this. They sound like, tell me about a time when you had to make a decision and you didn't have all the data that you needed. Or tell me about a time when you had a disgruntled customer and how you or your team responded. What was the outcome? So what hiring managers are looking for in those situations is they have a situation that might come up with frequency in the job that you're applying for, and they want to know how you walk through that, how you maybe attribute success to your teammates. They want to see what you view as a successful outcome, and behavioral questions are a way to do that. There are lots of resources. If you just do an internet search for behavioral interview questions, we have one on our website. Bentley probably does as well. But there are lots of ways to practice answers to those questions and how you frame it. You may look at skills testing, and employers may ask you to be doing that. They might have a short exercise that they want you to complete just to see how you present data. They might be wanting to know how you create a pitch for a product if it's a sales or marketing role, or maybe how you would assemble a plan. If they're looking to bring you in on digital marketing, what would you look at first? Some of them are more complex than others. LinkedIn has skills assessments that you can take for some things. They're mostly technical skills on LinkedIn, but there are a lot of different skills platforms where if you're just curious, where am I in Excel? Am I in intermediate or am I advanced? There are ways to find that out. And then you can you can not only talk about it in your resume or your interview, but it's also going to bring you that confidence level of knowing where you are. That could be in PowerPoint, it could be in another platform, but lots of ways to test that and be ready for that to be part of the interview. And again, exercise-based interviews where you're doing something that is work-related. Beware of something where somebody says, okay, we want you to do this 40-hour exercise as part of your interview. They may be looking for some free consulting, but something short, something that takes maybe less than a couple of hours to do is pretty normal, and especially in senior roles. So I like to talk about how you acknowledge your gap in an interview, because it does come up. And one of the things that happens, and I've had my own career gap, and mine was about 10 years ago, is that when you're coming back into the paid workforce, it is front and center for you. It is the thing that you think about. It's what I've been doing with my time for the last 4 or 5 years. I'm wondering how that's going to be valuable and how my skills will translate. And isn't the other person on the other side of the desk certainly thinking about this exact same thing? Chances are they're not. So really you want to just be focused on your skills and your successes, not your gap. We'll have lots of interviews where, I say, well, tell me a little bit about yourself. And it's the very first thing that people lead with. I'm used to that and I can redirect, but somebody who's not used to working with people who are coming back after a career break may not see that as a positive. So you really want to make sure that you're starting with your skills and your successes. If you can certainly weave your gap and your career break into your career story, but just make sure that you're not apologizing for it. You do want to be aware that, for some people, having a career break is a privilege, and it's, not something that everybody can make the choice or have the opportunity to do. And so, to think about your wording, but you want to be brief, not apologetic, and then redirect back to your experience and what's relevant to the job. The fourth part about expressing excitement, eagerness, and readiness to go back is sometimes something that people skip right over because they think, well, I wouldn't be here and interviewing for the job if I wasn't excited and eager to do this. But what we do hear from hiring managers sometimes is, I wasn't quite sure if they were excited about this job or if this was really it for them. And so even just simply stating at the end of an interview that you're excited, you're eager for the next steps, that you're ready to do this can go a long way. Okay, so moving right into tech skills, and I'm going to go through this last section pretty quickly. We have a readiness framework that we work within, but I want to focus just on productivity and aptitude. So not the deeply technical skills, but probably more in this middle section of workplace productivity. Productivity tools that you should definitely be aware of. You might be asking which ones and how do I upskill in these? This is a short list of things that if you're not current on, and these are typically used, especially in small business environments, Microsoft Office Suite, Google Suite, and a lot of cloud-based collaboration and communication tools. This really varies by company, by industry, and you certainly don't need to go out and learn them all. But if you see in a job description that they're using Slack for team communication, or that they are in Microsoft Office Suite, proficiency is required, you want to make sure that your skill set is current. And the way that you do that is to go online. There are so many classes through, Microsoft and Google certainly have their own. There are lots of other places where you can get those skills and brush up as well. If you do it through LinkedIn Learning, which is free through a lot of library systems, you can then have the added advantage of having that badge or that recognition on your LinkedIn profile. And YouTube, other types of learning platforms, edX, there's so many ways out there now to brush up on productivity and more deeply technical skills. The other thing you want to think about is practical experience. So if you are learning something for the first time, you want to have a way to demonstrate that you can do that. If you've recently learned how to use Outlook for team scheduling, or use Google Drive to share information, you want to take a look at how you're using that, either in a maybe targeted volunteering or a personal use, so that you can display aptitude and talk about something that's concrete. And lastly, before we wrap up and go to Q&A, I want to talk just a bit about confidence. It's not really something that you can kind of read up and say, okay, I'm going to practice my confidence now, but there are other ways that you can go about boosting your own confidence. And the biggest one is just being aware of how you're talking to yourself. We've all heard and learned a little bit now about growth mindset, and looking at experiences that we're having that are unsuccessful, or even as far as a failure, and what we're learning from that, because it's the learning piece that is going to be most important in demonstrating to someone in an employment situation. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody tries things that don't work. And what employers are going to be looking for, on a soft skill side is how do you recover from that? How do you learn? How do you incorporate that learning with your team? How do you take responsibility for that? So you can incorporate that into your own self-talk and being positive. Positive about decision to leave the workforce. I'm sure there are, reasons why we all chose to do that. And we did great things, even if it's raising small humans, or, taking time off for our own health, or we started a business and that business didn't move forward, but being positive about that decision and proud of the work that you've done while you're on break. Your successes, even if they were 8, 10, 15 years ago, are still yours. You still own them. They might have happened at a previous point in your career history, but how you talk about those can really help to build your confidence. And then sharpening your skills. And these don't all have to be work-related classes. If you think about classes that you've taken in the past where you've learned maybe how to play a musical instrument, or maybe throw pottery on a wheel, or do some mosaic work, when you accomplish something in that arena, that helps build confidence as well. So take a class, and it can be anything. Volunteering, interning again, and then maybe finding a mentor or accountability partner, someone to coach you and hold you accountable to what you're wanting to do as you move forward, can also be really a positive way to build your own confidence. And then just lastly is thinking about your trade-offs. So if you are thinking about what it is that you want to do next, just keep in mind that it doesn't have to be forever. Think of the next set of things that you're going to do as a series of stepping stones, if that's easier to envision. So if you're coming back into the paid workforce after, say, an 8-year break, and you maybe need to step to this, on a stone that's a little bit on the side of a straight path, but it's going to lead you to the next one, then that's a great way to move forward. You're inching your way forward. You're not taking giant leaps, but it doesn't have to be forever. You really want to think about, though, where your priorities fall. Is it your location to your home? Is it your flexibility? Is it the content or substance of your work that you're going to be doing, your work environment, and where all of these things fall, because they can really help you not only target the right things, but also talk about them confidently when you get there. Okay, so I've been talking a lot, and I know that you have some questions. I saw some on the registration, but we're going to turn over to a Q&A portion of our time today. And before we do that, I just wanted to point out the Bentley alumni career website, which Laura has also put into the chat, I think, and her email address. Lots of resources, some specific ones around, I think there's some professional communication resources as well as other webinars. And if you are looking for something with flexibility in either the Boston or the DC metro area, I would check out our website. We have new postings every day. And again, they range from project, part-time, full-time flex. And the best way to start the process is to upload a copy of your resume. It can be any copy. If you're polishing it off and you want to upload a new copy in 2 weeks, you can definitely do that. We also post all of our new jobs out on social. I've got the Boston social links here, but we also have them for our DC office and roles that are still based there. And then my contact and information is here. So with that, Laura, have you got any questions through the chat?
Looks like everyone's been taking it all in. There are no specific questions, so I assume everyone is digesting the content.
Yeah.
But we do actually have a question that just came in. How do you determine a fair rate or salary when you re-engage?
That is a great question. There are a lot of great resources for looking at salary. And it has a lot to do with your geography for sure, but also your level of responsibility. So if you haven't been there yet, you can go to glassdoor.com. And if you create an account, they allow you to see salary data for job title within companies. And these are user reported salaries. So that's a great way to do some research. You really want to focus in on what those responsibility levels are. You know, I think sometimes we automatically think, well, you know, my skill set is 5 years old. I'm going to have to take a big hit in salary, and you might to start if you're going in to a position that is below where you left. But you know, knowing your value can also help you find what the fair salary is. In Massachusetts, we have a Pay Equity Act as well. So when you're interviewing for a job, the rate should be posted for the job as it stands, and not based on what your past salary, your self-reported salary has been. So that's a plus. I know not everybody has that, but we do have that here. And so it's probably not listed in the job description, but it should be something that the employer tells you about once you start interviewing for the job.
Great, thank you. And another question, are there companies like yours, like Flex Professionals, in the New Haven, Connecticut area, or do you service any folks in that area currently?
So we don't have an office in Connecticut or New York, like that New York kind of New Haven corridor. We do have a few employees who work through the Boston office from Connecticut. They tend to be a little bit closer to Boston than New Haven, but we're not there yet. So unfortunately, no. There might be a light company though. I would take a look for, you know, staffing firm, flexibility, recruiting and staffing in your city area to see what's there.
Great, thank you. And another question that came in, do you have any advice on navigating ageism in the reentry process?
For sure. That's another whole topic that we could talk about that for quite a while, but ageism definitely exists. And, you know, especially if you think about the fact that, you know, someone in their 50s, maybe 60s might be interviewing with somebody in their 20s or 30s. We all have perceptions and biases, right, that come into play when we're talking to other people on both sides. I really like to be pretty direct. If I'm sensing in an interview that I'm older than most of the employees that I've seen on my way in or I've seen on the website, since I'm maybe interviewing virtually, I would probably bring it up as part of the interview process, especially if I'm sensing from the person interviewing me that there might be some ageism at play. And I would bring it up in a pretty gentle way. I might say something like, you might have a concern that I'm a little older than your typical employee. You know, let me tell you why I'm really interested in this job. And really, you know, you've addressed it, but then you're pivoting it right back to what you bring to the table, what your skill set is. And honestly, the folks that we work with, we place a lot of people over 50 years old, and we don't have the 2020 data, but in 2019, over half of our placements were people who were over 50. And I think 25% were over 55. And so older workers bring a lot of value to the workplace, and smart employers know that. The other thing you want to be thinking about is that if it is an issue, and especially if it's a direct issue, is that a company that you want to be working for? Is that part of your value system and a place where you want to be spending time? But there's so much value that people with tenure and life experience bring to their job that you might choose to focus in on some of that when you're interviewing as well, in terms of where you are stability wise, being upfront about that you're looking for a position where you can engage for at least 5 years and maybe longer, because a lot of younger people move around a little bit more often than older workers. So you can kind of highlight what those benefits are. But again, if you do sense that it's in the room, I would maybe take it on in a gentle way, very directly.
Great tips. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we have another question in the Q&A. In this example, if this individual is saying, if I have had a business that has not gone forward due to caregiving or children or parents, employers sometimes seem surprised when I'm applying for jobs, and I've tried to explain I would like the stability of being an employee instead of trying to focus on my own business. Do you have any recommendations on how to reframe this, as some employers are dismissive when listing their individual company?
So that sounds like there's a couple things that work in that question. I'll definitely talk about the business not moving forward. We're in an unprecedented time for people having career breaks and making career transitions. Even as little as a year and a half ago, someone making a wholesale career transition from, say, the restaurant industry into something completely different, you might have stopped and said, well, how is this going to be possible? But now, how is it not possible, right? So there are some transitions that are anticipated and just expected right now. And what I would, probably do is just focus on what the learnings were from that experience and what you're committed to do next. That commitment is really important. The fact that you're focused on what you want to see as your next step. We work with a lot of people who at one point or another have had their own business, whether that's been a sole proprietorship or they've had a startup business. And for one reason or another, it didn't move forward. Sometimes it's just that it wasn't what they wanted to do anymore. And so people can change direction from that just as they can from another job with an employer. So, look at the positives, look at what you learned, and really focus in on what you want to do next. I think those would be great ways to frame that kind of experience.
Great, thank you. And I think you've addressed some of this, and even just what you mentioned might address this additional question, which is, what is the best way to go about talking about, I'm assuming it's a career change that was referenced here from one of the participants, if there was a significant amount of time that has passed. And I think you've addressed a little bit earlier about really highlighting lessons learned, what you've accomplished, and really how you want to translate more of what you've done into your new role and what you've been doing during that time. But if you want to further elaborate on any bit of what you covered earlier, please feel free.
Well, and I would invite you to do that as well, Laura, because I know you are well versed in all of these topics. What would you say? What would your advice be?
Yeah, I mean, further to what you've beautifully articulated, so much will really come down to explaining where you've been and why that has really set you up for what's next. And while you may have to articulate that you've taken a break, there's usually a reason for it that can be completely understood and valued, because we're all human. We have life situations that change, and just being transparent with it. And I think, Leanne, you mentioned earlier, being really clear in the resume, even having in the section where maybe you are off for 2 years or whatever the time frame might be, really noting during those 2 years what you were doing. So be completely transparent in a written format. And then I also would even recommend in your cover letter. Actually, recently we've gone through a hiring process at Bentley, and there were a few candidates who we interviewed who very clearly articulated in their cover letter what they've been up to, where there was a gap in their resume. And I was wondering, and they just explained it in the cover letter, and it made it so much easier. I didn't even address it directly in the interview because I understood where they were coming from. So there is that way to really articulate where you've been in writing as well.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Yeah. The, one thing that I would add is that if there has been a situation that's taken you out of the paid workforce, whether that's somebody else's caregiving or your own health, having, and it could be in that cover letter, like Laura talked about, but having a place where you state that the situation is resolved. It could be on your resume, but I think cover letter is a great place to do that as well. Can go a long way as well. So if you had some elder care responsibilities and the people that you're caring for have been transitioned into a care facility, having a way to state that succinctly, or if you've had a health challenge that has been resolved and you're moving forward, that's another great thing to not bring too much of the personal in, because you don't want to disclose everything about your personal life, but having some kind of resolution can be really powerful as well.
Great, thank you. And we have 2 more questions, and I know it's after 1, so just wanted to do a little time check for everybody. So we'll answer these last 2 questions and then certainly send the recording to everyone afterwards. But one of the questions is there a harsher stigma for a stay-at-home dad returning to workforce? And if so, how would you address the situation?
Well, I'd like to think that there's not, but there probably is. We're a socially driven society, and, we all have our biases. But I'd probably address it in the same way that I would for someone of any gender, in that I'm being direct about it and I'm not apologetic. For a lot of people, it's a privilege to be able to do that. And, hopefully you've had a positive experience during your career break. But I would probably just address it very directly, like I would if I was a returning mom after caregiving, and then stating what I'm committed to do next. Yeah, there's power in confidence, I think, and confidently saying what you're doing and practicing that. There's a lot of power in that.
I love that. I agree with you. That power really comes off strongly to not apologize for where you've been. It sets you up for what's next. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And then the last question, to clarify, is there a resource or site that shows us an example of gap statements? And I will just say, in our career guides, we do not have a specific gap statement that's within our resume guide. And Leanne, do you happen to have any specific resources? That's a great question to look at an example.
I have some examples, and what I'd be happy to do, Laura, is forward them to you, and you could think about reworking the wording to include in the guide. But they're usually statements, and it depends on where they're going. But if it's going in your career chronology, it's a statement that shows, on self-imposed career sabbatical, during which time and then you're going to fill in the blank. You did volunteering, you went back for your master's degree, whatever it was that you were pursuing. Or if it's caregiving related, it may not be in your chronology. It may be at tail end of your profile statement or in your cover letter. So I'm happy to forward some language to Laura, and you can distribute that or incorporate it if you'd like. I haven't found any websites that specifically have career gap statements. Maybe we should add that to ours. So that's a great question.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leanne. Really appreciate you joining in the Bentley community, and for everybody who was able to join. It's always truly a pleasure to bring our community together. And so thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you. And for the community, if you want to continue to stay connected, I did put some resources in the chat so you can certainly stay updated on upcoming events. Check out our career resources website as well, and certainly check out the webinars that Flex Professionals will be offering to continue to dig deeper into this topic. And if you want to continue to network, there are resources available that Bentley's committed to as well, and we do have upcoming events. If you go to our alumni Falcons Online page to really see some of our upcoming events, we'd be happy to connect with you in that format as well.
Great. Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone who's here. And I hope if you're in the Boston area that I'll be working with you soon on your job search.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Stay well.